Welcome to the Deep Dive. I am your host, and today we are getting into something really, truly fascinating.
Yeah, I'm the resident data expert here, and I can tell you this one is quite a ride.
It really is. I mean, I want you, the listener, to imagine a country that spent like the last 30 years doing almost everything perfectly.
Right, and we mean perfectly by the absolute strictest definitions of global development.
Exactly. Like they practically eradicated maternal mortality, driving it down to a fraction of the global average. They built this education system that keeps almost their entire population in school for years longer than most of the world.
hmm And they generated so much wealth that their income just completely dwarfs the global average.
Yeah, by every traditional metric, every ledger, every chart we usually look at, they essentially won the game of economics. They are the model of success.
And here's the huge but. What happens when you suddenly realize that the trophy they won was manufactured by extracting 21 tons of earth per person every single year?
Wow, 21 tons.
Yeah. What happens when you realize the foundation of that undeniable prosperity might actually be, well, entirely unsustainable?
It creates this profound cognitive dissonance, right?
Right.
Because we are so conditioned to look at progress as a binary thing.
Exactly. The gross domestic product goes up, we celebrate, the line goes down, we panic.
Right. But when you introduce the physical reality of what it actually takes to make that line go up, you realize that those traditional metrics might be hiding an entirely unsustainable environmental cost.
Yeah, it forces us to ask a really tough question. Is this actual prosperity we're looking at, or is it an illusion built on, borrowing against the future?
Exactly. And that tension, that exact question is the
Ah,
perfect setup for where we are going today. Okay, let's unpack this. Today's target is a massive, incredibly detailed stack of data from the United Nations Development
so
Program.
NDP.
Right, the UNDP. We are looking at 33 years of continuous granular data, stretching from 1990 all the way to 2023. And our lens for this entire exploration is the nation of Malaysia.
And it is crucial to state right up front that the goal here isn't just to read a list of numbers off a spreadsheet to you.
No, definitely not.
We are using Malaysia as a fascinating, almost surgically perfect case study for a much larger global phenomenon. We are going to deconstruct the Human Development Index.
The HDI.
Right, the HDI. But more importantly, we're going to look at its critical and sometimes brutal adjustments.
Yeah, the adjustments are where the real story is.
Exactly. We will be applying adjustments for systemic inequality, for gender disparities, and finally, for planetary pressures.
Right. And for those of you listening, I want you to just picture a standard graph in your mind. On this graph, there is a bright golden arrow. It's trending steadily, confidently upward, representing Malaysia's incredible rise in global rankings over the last 3 decades.
They really are universally recognized as a high development success story.
They are, but then suddenly that golden arrow is intersected by a sharp, jagged green line that just crashes downward.
It's a steep drop.
Yeah. Because when a new green variable is introduced, when the UN actually accounts for the environmental cost of that success, Malaysia's global standing plummets by a staggering 21 places.
It is a statistical earthquake. I mean, dropping 21 places in a global ranking isn't a minor correction.
No, not a
Oh,
bit.
it's a fundamental reevaluation of a nation's status on the world stage.
It really is. And that crash is the central mystery of our deep dive today. But, to understand the crash, we first have to understand the climb.
Right. How they got up there in the first place.
Exactly. We have to look at how Malaysia built this ironclad reputation as a development powerhouse. So let's zoom in on this Human Development Index timeline.
The 1990 to 2023 spread.
Yeah. In 1990, Malaysia was sitting at a score of 0.653. Now, for anyone who doesn't look at UNDP data all day, that's a respectable middle-tier score for that era.
Pretty standard developing nation baseline.
Right, but from there, it is just this steady, almost relentless climb. By 2023, they are hitting 0.819.
To give that some immediate global context, the world average in 2023 sits at 0.756.
Okay, wow.
So Malaysia isn't just marginally beating the average. They have firmly entrenched themselves in what the UN officially categorizes as the very high human development tier.
Very high.
Yeah. And what stands out to me as an analyst isn't just that final number, but the certainty and the stability of that growth over 33 years.
It's just a straight lineup.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
It wasn't a flash in the pan. It wasn't a temporary boom caused by a single lucky resource find. It was structural, sustained growth.
So let's deconstruct that 0.819 score. Because the HDI isn't just one monolithic number pulled out of thin air, right? It's a composite.
Right, it's an aggregation.
Yeah, it's built on three foundational pillars: health, education, and income. And we really need to look at the actual lives behind those pillars, starting with health. Life expectancy at birth in Malaysia is now 76.7 years.
Which is a remarkable achievement, especially when you compare it to the global average of 73.4 years.
That's over 3 extra years.
Exactly. That is more than 3 extra years of life for the average citizen. And from a developmental standpoint, adding 3 years to a national average requires massive systemic investments.
Like what specifically?
Oh, you're talking about sanitation, preventative medicine, geriatric care. It's not just a lucky genetic pool, it's infrastructure.
Right. Then we move to the second pillar, which is education. The mean years of schooling, which measures how long the average adult has actually spent in the classroom, stands at 11.1 years in Malaysia.
And again, they are crushing the world average here.
Yeah, what is the world average?
It currently sits at only 8.8 years.
Wow, okay.
And we really have to pause on what that gap actually means. The difference between 8 years and 11 years of schooling is transformative.
Yeah, that's like middle school versus graduating high school.
Precisely. 8 years gets you basic literacy and numeracy. 11 years takes you into advanced secondary education. It's the literal difference between a workforce prepared for manual labor and agricultural work and a workforce equipped with critical thinking, technical skills, and the ability to adapt to a modern industrialized economy.
I see where you're going with that. You need that 11-year baseline to build the kind of economy they have today. Because that brings us to the third pillar, and this is where my jaw kind of dropped as I was going through the sources.
The income data.
Yes, we've seen solid wins in health and education, but then we look at income. Gross national income, or GNI, per capita in Malaysia is $32,553. I'm looking at this and trying to wrap my head around it. How does this compare globally?
Well, the global average for GNI per capita is just $20,327.
Wow.
Yeah, Malaysia's sitting on a massive delta there.
It's an enormous gap. I was trying to think of how to explain the mechanics of this overall HDI score. It's almost like looking at a corporate balance sheet where you have different departments performing at different levels.
Okay, I like that analogy.
Right. Like the health and education departments in Malaysia. Those are really solid, high-performing divisions, like a solid B+. They are operating well above the industry standard. But that income department that is the A+ cash cow that is artificially masking everything else.
Yeah, it's pulling the whole average up.
Exactly. They have a near 60% lead in income over the global average. That localized wealth generation is the true engine driving Malaysia's HDI into that top tier.
Yeah, that's a highly accurate way to frame it. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, we really have to ask how they generated that cash flow. You don't jump to a $32,000 GNI by accident.
No, definitely not.
This goes back to their massive economic transition over the last few decades. Malaysia pivoted hard from an agriculture-heavy economy to becoming a global export hub.
So we're talking about electronics and stuff.
Exactly. The rise of their semiconductor manufacturing industry, the explosion of palm oil exports, and the implementation of massive national economic policies designed to rapidly industrialize the nation.
Right.
Income-driven development is incredibly fast. You can scale industries and raise that GNI per capita in a single generation if you have the right export strategy.
But, I mean, building a development score almost entirely around massive income generation feels a little precarious, doesn't it?
It is inherently fragile. It relies on continuous output, continuous market demand, continuous consumption.
Yeah.
And fundamentally, when a national average is being pulled up that aggressively by pure wealth generation, it begs an immediate vital question: how is that wealth actually being distributed across the population?
Exactly, because an average can be incredibly deceptive. If we have a room of 10 people and one person has $10 million while the other 9 have nothing, the average wealth in that room is $1 million.
But 9 people are still destitute.
Right, so is everyone in Malaysia actually getting a slice of this $32,000 pie? That brings us from the polished illusion of the golden average to the friction of reality on the ground.
Which is precisely why the UN developed the IHDI, the Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index.
Right. So let's watch what happens to that pristine 0.819 score when we apply the inequality haircut. When the data is adjusted to reflect how health, education, and income are actually distributed across the population, Malaysia's score drops to 0.707.
Significant drop.
Yeah, that represents a 13.7% loss in overall human development, entirely due to systemic inequality.
Now, a 13.7% loss sounds like a harsh penalty on paper. But as analysts, we need to contextualize this immediately against the global backdrop.
Okay, fair.
It sounds bad, but the global average loss due to inequality is nearly 22%.
Oh, wow. Almost a quarter.
Exactly. There are nations that lose a full third of their development score to unequal distribution. So from a systemic standpoint, Malaysia is actually significantly outperforming the world in equitable distribution. Their wealth, their clinics, their schools, they're spread far more evenly than the global norm.
Okay, I hear you. Beating the global average of 22% is statistically impressive. I will absolutely give them credit for that relative victory. But let me push back a bit here,
Go for it.
because we aren't just talking about abstract math on a spreadsheet. We're talking about actual human potential. Losing 1/7 of your nation's potential development because of inequality still means millions of people are essentially locked out.
Yeah, that's true.
They are locked out of the best classrooms, they can't access the top-tier clinics, or they're just geographically isolated from those high-paying semiconductor jobs you mentioned. Even if it's better than average, isn't a 13.7% loss still a massive structural leak in the bucket for a country trying to maintain its status as a fully developed top-tier nation?
That is absolutely a valid pushback, and the granular data completely supports your concern. Yes, the systemic distribution is relatively good compared to the rest of the planet, but if you dig into the underlying coefficients in this data set, the gaps in education and income across different demographics within Malaysia remain a persistent drag.
Right. Like urban versus rural.
Exactly. You have profound urban versus rural divides. The reality of infrastructure in a hypermodern city like Kuala Lumpur is very different from the rural realities in the Borneo states of Sabah and Sarawak.
Yeah, makes sense.
They are doing well macroscopically, but that 13.7% is the friction preventing true national optimization. Is the friction between being a developing success story and a fully optimized developed nation.
So if we want to find exactly where that friction is happening, where that leak in the bucket is most pronounced, we need to slice the data differently.
Let's do.
We need to look beyond geography and look at demographics. We need to split the data by gender. And for anyone listening, I want you to pay really close attention here, because this is where the story takes a wild turn.
It really does.
We are going to look at some unexpected, almost miraculous triumphs before we hit an absolute brick wall.
Let's start with those triumphs because they are historic.
Yes. Let's look at the Gender Development Index, the GDI. This metric compares the HDI of women directly to the HDI of men. Malaysia's GDI score is a stellar 0.973. To break that down, the female HDI is 0.805 and the male is 0.828. They are incredibly close.
They are, and that ratio is well above the global average of 0.955. It shows that in the foundational building blocks of a good life, living long, learning and earning, men and women in Malaysia are progressing almost in tandem.
And it gets even more impressive when we look at the Gender Inequality Index, or GII. Now, just to clarify the mechanics for a second, unlike the HDI where higher is better, for the GII, a lower score is better.
Right, because it measures loss.
Exactly. It measures the loss of achievement due to gender disparities. The global average is 0.455. Malaysia's score is a phenomenal 0.172.
That specific score places them 47th globally out of nearly 200 countries.
That's amazing.
It is. That is a top-tier, undisputed performance in minimizing systemic gender inequality. It is one of the brightest spots in their entire data set.
I really want us to put some real human faces on these numbers because the specific wins here are staggering, especially when we look at reproductive health. Let's look at the maternal mortality ratio.
Okay.
In Malaysia, it is incredibly low, 21.1 deaths per 100,000 live births. I have the global data right here, and the world average is a tragic 216.1 deaths per 100,000.
Yeah, the difference is night and day.
Malaysia's rate is literally 1/10 of the global average. How did they actually achieve that?
What's fascinating here is that this isn't just a statistical victory. These are monumental victories in public health policy and physical infrastructure. You don't drop maternal mortality to 1/10 of the global average by accident.
Right, it has to be intentional.
Highly intentional.
Yeah.
It requires deliberate, decades-long initiatives. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, Malaysia invested heavily in rural healthcare networks. They focused on training and deploying skilled birth attendants and midwives to remote areas.
Wow, so really getting out into the communities.
Exactly. They built a system where emergency obstetrics and prenatal care became accessible regardless of geography. They built the roads to get ambulances to villages. They are literally saving thousands of lives every single year that in other parts of the developing world would be lost.
That is incredible context. And the adolescent birth rate reflects that exact same level of systemic care and education. It's just 5.96 births per 1,000 young women in Malaysia.
And the world average.
The world average is almost 39. So young women in Malaysia are not being derailed by early unsafe pregnancies. They are surviving.
And importantly, they are not just surviving. They are preparing for the future. Look at the education data in that same section.
Oh, the education data is amazing. 79% of Malaysian women have at least some secondary education. That almost perfectly mirrors the men's rate of 82.1%.
Almost identical.
Yeah, and it vastly outperforms the global female average, which is lagging terribly behind at just 62%.
So if we synthesize all of this, the takeaway is incredibly positive. Malaysia has virtually solved the foundational gender issues of the 20th century.
Right.
They have figured out how to keep young women alive, how to keep them healthy, and how to keep them in school at rates that rival the best in the world. They've built an incredibly capable pipeline of human capital.
Exactly. They are surviving, they are thriving, and they are getting highly educated. Which leads to the most obvious, glaring question: where are these highly educated, healthy women going next?
And this is where the data reveals a shocking contradiction. This is your brick wall.
It really is. Because logically, if you have an education rate that practically matches the men, you would expect a workforce participation rate that matches the men.
Naturally.
You would expect them to be flooding into those high-paying industries we talked about earlier. But let's look at the labor force participation numbers. The male participation rate is a very robust 81.9%. The female participation rate, it plunges to just 55.8%.
That is a 26% gap.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. I was trying to wrap my head around the sheer scale of this waste.
It's massive.
It's like a country spending millions of dollars to train an elite world-class team of Olympic marathon runners. You build the best training facilities, you give them the best doctors to keep them healthy, you give them the best coaches, you get them to peak physical and mental condition over a decade.
Right. Doing everything right.
Yeah, and then you line them up at the starting line and you tell half the team they aren't allowed to race, they just have to go home and watch from the sidelines.
That is precisely what is happening economically.
Yeah.
And as analysts, we have to ask why. Because the numbers clearly show it isn't a lack of capacity and it isn't a lack of education or health.
Right.
So what is the mechanism keeping them out? Sociological and economic analyses of this specific 26% gap point to deeply entrenched systemic workplace barriers.
Let's unpack those barriers. What are we actually talking about here?
We are talking primarily about the economics of unpaid care work. There are rigid cultural expectations regarding childcare and elder care that still disproportionately, almost exclusively, fall on women in many societies, and Malaysia is no exception.
Right, the second shift.
Exactly. When you have inflexible corporate cultures that do not accommodate working mothers, no flexible hours, inadequate maternity leave, lack of affordable childcare, women are forced to make an impossible choice. Furthermore, you have invisible cultural ceilings that limit upward mobility.
So they hit a wall.
Yes. A highly educated woman might enter the workforce, look up, see no path to leadership because of institutional bias, and decide the friction isn't worth the return.
So the society has modernized its schools and its hospitals, but its corporate and workplace culture is still stuck in a previous era.
Exactly. And from a purely cold macroeconomic standpoint, leaving aside the obvious moral argument for equality, this is an unforgivable waste of economic potential.
Yeah, it's just bad.
It really is. You have an immense reservoir of human capital trained at great expense to the state, completely sidelined. It is a shadow economy of unpaid labor that actively suppresses the GDP.
If you're listening to this right now, I want you to think about your own workplace for a second. Think about the most competent, brilliant, highly educated people you interact with daily. Now imagine if a quarter of them just vanished tomorrow.
Just gone.
Yeah. Not because they weren't smart enough or capable enough, but because of a rigid, outdated cultural expectation. Think about how much talent, how much innovation, how much pure economic output is lost when highly educated demographics hit these invisible ceilings.
It's a huge loss.
It's a tragedy for the individual, yes, but it's a massive self-inflicted wound for the national economy.
And I would argue that this economic wound becomes an existential threat when we look at our next set of data.
Oh, definitely.
Because Malaysia needs all the innovation, all the engineering talent, and all the human capital it can possibly get to solve the massive problem hiding in the final part of this UNDP report.
Right. The green variable. Let's circle back to the cliffhanger from our intro. We've seen how Malaysia treats its people, the immense wealth it generates, the brilliant health outcomes, the paradox of its female workforce.
Yeah.
But how does it treat its physical environment to generate that $32,000 GNI per capita?
This is where we introduce the PHDI, the Planetary Pressures Adjusted Human Development Index. This is the metric that attempts to answer the core question, what is the ecological cost of a nation's prosperity?
Okay, let's pull up that mental graph again.
Huh.
Remember that golden .819 score? The one that had Malaysia sitting pretty in the very high human development tier.
Yeah.
When the UN adjusts that score for environmental impact, it plummets to .677.
That represents a 17.3% penalty on their overall development score.
And just to compare, the global average deduction for planetary pressures is only 10.1%. Malaysia is being penalized almost twice as heavily as the rest of the world. Why is the drop so severe?
It means their specific growth model is disproportionately taxing the planet. We need to look at the exact mechanisms the culprits driving this penalty.
Okay, what are they?
In the UNDP framework, it usually comes down to two main factors, carbon emissions and material footprint.
Let's look at the carbon first. Malaysia is emitting 8.42 tons of CO2 per capita. That is roughly 1.5 times the global average of 4.54 tons.
That's significant.
Very. And it's not just a snapshot of today. Looking at the timeline, it's been a steep, steady rise from just 3.1 tons back in 1990.
It perfectly tracks their economic rise. The industrialization we praised earlier, the manufacturing, the exports, it was all powered by burning fossil fuels.
Right.
But while the carbon number is high, the second metric is the one that truly alarms environmental economists, the material footprint.
Yes, 21.39 tons per capita.
While the world average is 12.71 tons.
I really want us to pause and visualize what 21.39 tons of material actually means because it's so easy for a number like that to just wash over us.
It's hard to picture.
It is. This isn't just throwing away a few extra plastic bottles or using too many paper bags at the grocery store. We are talking about this sheer physical weight of the earth that must be moved to sustain one person's lifestyle.
Yeah.
We are talking about biomass, fossil fuels, metal ores, and non-metallic minerals.
Exactly. When we talk about non-metallic minerals, for instance, we are talking about millions of tons of sand and gravel dredged from rivers and coastlines for concrete.
To build the cities.
Right, to build those cities and land reclamations. We're talking about the massive clearing of ancient peat swamp forests to make way for the palm oil plantations that drive their agricultural exports.
So if we use the theater of the mind for a second, imagine a split screen. On the left side, you have this towering, gleaming, ultra-modern skyscraper in Kuala Lumpur. It represents the immense wealth, the 11 years of schooling, the 76-year life expectancy. It is the pinnacle of human development.
The golden arrow.
Exactly. But on the right side of the screen, you have a heavily mined, scarred landscape. You see rivers dredged to the bedrock, forests cleared and burning, hillsides excavated for raw materials. What this UNDP data is doing is forcing us to view both screens at the exact same time.
And what's fascinating here is that it shatters the illusion of a weightless digital economy.
Oh, that's a good point.
Yeah. Malaysia's high GNI isn't coming from thin air, and it isn't coming primarily from software or high-level services. It is a highly consumptive, physically heavy economic model. It is being heavily extracted from the earth.
And the consequence of looking at both screens simultaneously is that statistical earthquake we mentioned at the very beginning. When ranked by the normal HDI, Malaysia is 67th in the world.
A very respectable rank.
But when ranked by the planetary adjusted PHDI, they drop to 88th, a drop of 21 places.
It fundamentally redefines their status. And it brings us to the ultimate reckoning. We've laid the numbers bare. We have a high-income, highly educated nation that is simultaneously wasting a quarter of its top talent and consuming physical resources at a profoundly unsustainable rate. So how does this end?
Yeah, where do they go from here? Because basic physics dictates they can't just keep digging 21 tons of rock and wood out of the ground forever. Eventually you hit bedrock.
No, they can't. And this introduces the most critical economic concept of the next 50 years, green decoupling.
Okay, let's unpack that concept for the listener. What exactly is green decoupling and how does it work?
Historically, since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, human development and environmental destruction have been permanently locked together. They were coupled.
Hand in hand.
Right. You want a higher HDI. You want longer life expectancy and better schools. You have to build more infrastructure. That means you burn more coal, you pour more concrete, you cut down more trees. Decoupling is the urgent, desperate need to break that historic link.
So separating the two lines.
Exactly. A country must figure out how to keep its HDI high, keep its people healthy and wealthy, while simultaneously driving its carbon emissions and material footprint down.
So it's separating the golden arrow going up from the green jagged line going down.
Hmm,
You want the golden arrow to rise, but the green line needs to stabilize or drop.
precisely. And if a nation cannot decouple, their developed status is in grave danger. We are entering an era where global trade frameworks are aggressively changing.
Right, like the new regulations coming in.
Yeah, we are seeing the introduction of carbon border adjustment mechanisms where massive economic blocs like the European Union will begin financially penalizing imports from high-carbon, high-material nations.
Wow. So it hits the wallet.
Hard. If Malaysia doesn't transition, their export-heavy, resource-intensive economy will be taxed into stagnation by the global market. The illusion of prosperity will shatter.
Okay, I hear that analysis and the data makes sense, but I have to push back here because I can hear people listening to this and thinking about the fundamental fairness of it all.
Okay, let's hear it.
Hasn't literally every single developed nation gone through a massive, dirty, resource-burning phase to get rich? I mean, look at the UK during the 19th century or the United States in the 20th century.
Oh, absolutely.
They burned every piece of coal they could find, they leveled forests, they industrialized with zero regard for planetary pressures to build their foundational wealth. Isn't it incredibly hypocritical for these global metrics, designed largely by Western institutions, to suddenly penalize a developing country like Malaysia for doing the exact same thing the West did to get rich?
It is a profound, incredibly vital historical critique. And from a standpoint of historical climate justice, it is absolutely true. The early industrialized nations built their immense wealth on unrestricted emissions and resource extraction without facing any global penalties or carbon taxes.
Right. It feels like the West is saying, we got ours, we built our skyscrapers, but now you have to be green. You can't use your own natural resources to fund your transition.
It is a massive friction point in global diplomacy. But here is the impartial physical reality we have to deal with. Stripped of any moral judgment or historical grievance, the atmosphere does not care about fairness.
Right. Physics is physics.
Exactly. The Earth's carbon budget, the literal atmospheric physics of our planet, simply cannot accommodate a repeat of the 20th century playbook. We cannot have nations of millions of people repeating the material footprint of the United States or Europe. The Earth will simply break.
So the metric, this planetary adjusted index, isn't passing a moral judgment on Malaysia's history.
No, not at all. It is a cold, hard, unfeeling measurement of future viability. The Earth's capacity is full. The old, dirty path to wealth that the West used is closed, period.
So it's less of a penalty and more of a survival metrics. It's essentially a signpost saying, the bridge you are trying to cross is out. You have to find a new way over the river.
Exactly. And the path forward, the way to build a new bridge, requires Malaysia to merge its two main problems into a single, elegant solution.
Oh, I like where this is going. Connect the dots for us. How do they solve both?
Think about the massive pool of sideline talent we discussed earlier. All those women with advanced secondary and tertiary education who are locked out of the workforce due to cultural and systemic barriers.
The marathon runners on the sidelines?
Yes. Now think about the environmental problem. Malaysia is currently relying on a resource-heavy, material-extracting economy. To survive the 21st century and achieve green decoupling, they must transition to a high-value, knowledge-based economy.
So less mining, more thinking.
Exactly. We are talking about software development, financial services, advanced engineering, green technology, and research.
Which requires brains, not brawn. It requires massive amounts of human capital, not literal tons of sand and timber.
Yes. By fixing the workplace culture, implementing flexible policies, and bringing those highly educated women into the workforce, you solve the gender gap. You unleash a tidal wave of intellectual capital.
And that solves the green problem.
Exactly. By utilizing that influx of brainpower to transition to a digital and advanced services economy, you reduce your reliance on material extraction, solving your carbon and material footprint. Inclusive growth becomes the actual engine for green decoupling.
Wow.
You literally cannot solve the environmental problem without first solving the gender and inequality problem.
That is a brilliant synthesis. So what does this all mean for the listener? Let's bring this home. Let's look at the final scorecard for our deep dive today.
Let's do it.
We've spent an hour pulling apart 33 years of Malaysia's history, dissecting their rise and their stumbles. On the green check side of the ledger, we have an undeniable triumph in public health. Maternal mortality practically eradicated compared to global averages, giving thousands of mothers a chance to raise their families.
A huge win.
Huge. We have a highly educated population across both genders and an income level that wildly dwarfs the global average.
But on the red alert side,
Mhm.
we have an invisible cultural ceiling draining the economy of its female talent, creating a shadow economy of unpaid labor.
Huh.
And perhaps most urgently, we have a profoundly unsustainable reliance on extracting raw materials and burning carbon that threatens to derail their entire economic future if global trade paradigms shift.
It's a fragile success. It's an economy balancing on a knife's edge between a glorious future and ecological bankruptcy.
It is. And it leaves us with a critical thought to take away. We've spent this time looking intensely at Malaysia, holding their numbers up to the light. But this data, this specific PHDI metric, really forces us to look in the mirror.
How so?
Because the critique we leveled at Malaysia applies globally. If the very definition of being a developed nation requires stripping the Earth of 21 tons of material per person every single year, then perhaps our entire global definition of the word developed is fundamentally broken.
That's a heavy thought.
I want the listener to think about their own country's metrics, wherever they are listening from. When you hear about your GDP growing, or your stock markets hitting record highs, or your national wealth expanding, are you actually celebrating sustainable prosperity? Or are you just celebrating how efficiently and quickly you can borrow against your grandchildren's future?
Wow. That brings us right back to the beginning. The X-ray machine is broken. The simple charts don't tell the whole story. You can't just look at the line going up and assume the patient is healthy.
You really can't.
You have to look at what's in the shadows. You have to look at who is left behind and what was destroyed to make that line arise. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. I encourage you to question the numbers you see in the news this week. Look past the golden averages and always look for the story hidden in the data. We'll see you next time.